Rain fell in heavy sheets over the southern highway that night, hammering the tin roof of a garage that had stood at the edge of town for more than 50 years without ever once closing its doors to a traveler in need. 8 motorcycles rolled to a stumbling stop in the mud outside, their engines coughing, sputtering, and finally dying one after another, as if some invisible hand had reached into every carburetor at once. The riders sat stunned in the downpour, soaked to the bone, staring at machines that refused to answer them, no matter how many times they twisted the throttle. The only light for miles came from a single bulb swinging above a battered garage door, and beneath it stood an old woman closing up for the night, her silhouette small against the storm. She was 72 years old, her hands scarred and calloused from decades of turning wrenches, her jacket stained with a lifetime of oil that no amount of washing could ever fully remove. None of the men expected help from her, and most of them barely glanced twice before dismissing her entirely. What happened before sunrise would leave every one of them changed forever, and by the time the light broke over the horizon, an entire town would fall silent, watching a line of black limousines pull up to that same crumbling garage. The highway outside her garage had seen thousands of travelers over the decades, truckers hauling freight through the night, families driving home from visits with relatives, young couples on road trips that never quite went as planned. Most of them never stopped at all, passing her small light in the darkness without a second glance, assuming there was nothing worth their attention in a building so old and so plain. Martha had long since stopped expecting anything different from strangers passing through, content instead with the quiet rhythm of a life spent fixing what others considered broken beyond repair. Tonight would be no different in her mind. Just another storm, just another set of travelers needing help before continuing on their way toward wherever they were headed. She had no way of knowing, as she reached for the chain on her door, that this particular night would end up different from every other night she had spent inside these walls. The woman's name was Martha Johnson, and she had lived alone for longer than most of the riders. Standing before her had even been alive. Her garage sat apart from the rest of the town, tucked behind a stand of old oaks that bent low with the weight of the storm, its walls made of rusted sheet metal that had somehow survived hurricanes, floods, and 40 winters, without ever losing its stubborn shape. Inside, everything had a place. Tools hung in careful rows, and the concrete how the faint outlines of decades of oil stains that told their own quiet history. She had just reached for the chain to pull the door shut when the first engine sputtered in the distance, followed by 7 more dying in a ragged chorus behind it, one right after the other like dominoes falling in the dark. Martha paused, listening the way a doctor listens to a heartbeat, already knowing something was wrong before she ever laid eyes on the men. She stepped out into the rain without hesitation, an old flashlight in one hand, and found 8 leather-clad bikers pushing their stalled machines toward her open bay with looks of disbelief still frozen on their rain-soaked faces. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with a gray beard soaked flat against his jaw, looked her up and down and let out a short laugh that carried no warmth in it at all. "Grandma," he said, "you actually fix bikes out here, all by yourself, in a place like this?" Another voice chimed in from behind him, laughing harder, saying they needed a real mechanic, not somebody's grandmother standing alone in a doorway at midnight. The rest of the group joined the laughter, some shaking their heads, others simply staring at her, with the kind of pity people reserve for something they have already decided is beneath their notice. Martha did not raise her voice or rush to defend herself against their words, though she had certainly heard worse from angrier men on colder nights than this one. She only tilted her head slightly, water dripping from the brim of her old cap, and told them that if they were not in a hurry, she would be glad to take a look at whatever trouble had found them. There was nothing bitter in the way she said it, only patience, the kind that comes from a lifetime spent proving herself to people who never once thought to ask. The leader of the group, a lean man named Jake, with sharp eyes and an even sharper temper, crossed his arms and studied her for a long moment, before finally nodding toward the open bay behind her. He did not trust her, not for a second, but the rain was cold, and the nearest town with a real repair shop sat over 30 miles down a flooded highway, and none of them had a better option waiting for them tonight. The men wheeled their motorcycles inside one by one, dripping onto the concrete floor, muttering under their breath about how the night could not possibly get any worse than it already had. Martha said nothing about their comments, choosing instead to let her actions speak louder than any argument ever could. She simply reached for her tools, arranged along a wall in a way that showed decades of practiced order, and got to work on the first motorcycle without asking anyone's permission or approval to begin. Something about the calm in her hands made a few of the men stop laughing almost immediately, though none of them would have admitted it out loud just yet. She began with the spark plugs, pulling each one free, with a steady twist that showed no hesitation whatsoever, holding them up to the light, with eyes that had clearly done this thousands of times before, across countless stormy nights, just like this one. Grime told her stories the way words told other people's stories, and she read the black soot on the electrodes like a woman reading a familiar page from a book she had memorized long ago. Next came the fuel filter, clogged from months of neglect, followed by a careful inspection of the injectors that most casual riders would never think to check on their own machines. She moved to the electronic control units last, her fingers tracing wires with a precision that seemed almost impossible for hands that looked so worn and weathered by time. The bikers who had been laughing only minutes earlier grew quieter with every passing minute, watching her work with a kind of confused respect they were not yet ready to name out loud. Even the rain outside seemed to soften slightly, as though the storm itself had decided to let her concentrate on the delicate work in front of her. Jake remained unconvinced, despite the silence settling over his friends. His arms still folded tightly, his jaw still tight with suspicion. He refused to let go of easily. He watched Martha reassemble the first engine and turn the key, listening as it roared to life on the very first try, purring smoother than it had run in months, according to its own relieved owner. "Maybe it was just luck," he muttered to the man standing beside him, refusing to give the old woman more credit than he thought a stranger deserved on a night like this. Martha heard him, of course, since the garage was small and sound carried easily off the metal walls surrounding them, but she only smiled and moved on to the second motorcycle without offering a single word of protest. Her calm was not weakness, and something in the way she carried herself suggested she had faced far harsher judgments than his over the course of her long, quiet life. The second engine started just as easily as the first had, and Jake's frown deepened even as his men began to visibly relax around him for the first time all night. As the night wore on, the temperature outside dropped further, and the wind began driving rain sideways through the small cracks along the old garage walls. One motorcycle in particular refused to cooperate, the newest and most expensive machine in the entire group, a model so recent that even its own manufacturer struggled to explain what could possibly have gone wrong with it. Its owner, a younger rider named Danny, grew increasingly frustrated as he called the dealership's emergency service line, holding his phone up so a distant technician could walk him through basic diagnostics over a shaky, flickering video connection. They tried resetting the electrical system, checking every battery terminal twice, and running through a dozen troubleshooting steps that led absolutely nowhere useful at all. Danny finally set the phone down, defeated, admitting quietly that even the trained professionals on the other end of the line had no answers left to offer him tonight. The bike sat there in the corner, silent and stubborn, seeming almost to mock every attempt made against it by grown men who considered themselves experts. Martha wiped her hands on a rag and walked over without being asked, kneeling beside the machine the way a nurse might kneel beside a patient whose symptoms nobody else could quite identify. She studied it for several long minutes without speaking, her eyes scanning wires and connections that no factory manual could ever fully explain to an outsider. Then she reached toward a nearly invisible section near the wiring harness, a spot so small and so well hidden that most trained mechanics would have missed it entirely, even under proper lighting conditions. She found a hairline fracture in a single connector, a flaw so minor it seemed almost impossible that it could disable an entire engine on its own. Within 5 minutes, using nothing but a soldering iron and steady, patient hands, she repaired the fracture and reconnected the wire with the quiet confidence of someone who had done far more complicated work under far worse conditions than this. When Danny finally turned the key again, the motorcycle roared to life instantly, and the entire garage fell into a stunned, disbelieving silence that lasted several long seconds. During a brief pause for coffee, one of the younger bikers, a quiet man named Marcus, finally worked up the courage to ask Martha where exactly she had learned to fix engines with such remarkable precision and speed. She poured the coffee slowly, taking her time before answering, and said only that it had been a long time ago, back when the world looked very different than it does now for people who looked like her. She offered no further explanation. No names, no dates, nothing that might satisfy the curiosity, now spreading through the small room, like a quiet wildfire among the men. The vagueness of her answer only deepened the mystery surrounding her, and several of the men exchanged uneasy glances, wondering what kind of story she had chosen not to share with them tonight. Outside, headlights swept briefly across the fogged windows as a patrol car pulled slowly into the gravel lot beside the garage, its tires crunching softly through the mud. A moment later, the local sheriff stepped through the door, shaking rain from the brim of his hat before he ever said a single word. Word of the stranded bikers had already begun spreading quietly through the sleepy town by the time the storm eased, carried along by the kind of small-town gossip that traveled faster than any highway ever could. A waitress at the all-night diner mentioned it to a trucker passing through, who mentioned it to a gas station attendant, who eventually mentioned it to Sheriff Collins himself when he stopped for coffee before his rounds. None of them knew the full story yet, only that a group of rough-looking strangers had broken down outside old Martha's place sometime after midnight. The sheriff had simply nodded, unsurprised, and finished his coffee before climbing back into his patrol car and heading straight for the garage without another word to anyone. He had known Martha for longer than he cared to count, and he had learned decades ago never to doubt what she was capable of, no matter how the situation might have looked to strangers passing through. Sheriff Collins was a heavy-set man with decades of service behind him, known throughout the county for being firm but endlessly fair with everyone he ever encountered on duty. The moment his eyes landed on Martha, his entire posture changed, and he removed his hat entirely, nodding toward her with something that looked remarkably close to reverence rather than the usual professional courtesy. "Evening, ma'am," he said quietly, his voice carrying a level of respect none of the bikers had shown her just hours earlier when they first arrived. Martha greeted him warmly, calling him by his first name, the two of them clearly sharing a history that stretched back further than anyone in the room could possibly guess at. The bikers watched this exchange unfold with growing confusion, unable to understand why a man with a badge and 30 years of authority behind him would treat an old garage owner with such open deference. Jake, in particular, found himself studying Martha with entirely new eyes, though his stubborn pride refused to let the confusion show plainly on his face just yet. The garage itself seemed to hold more history than its rusted walls let on, and the longer the bikers stood inside it, the more they noticed small details they had overlooked in their earlier haste to get warm and dry. Old calendars from decades past still hung near the workbench, their pages frozen on months that had long since passed into memory, never removed, never replaced. A row of handwritten logbooks sat on a shelf near the register, their spines cracked from years of use, each one filled with careful notes about engines repaired and travelers helped along this same stretch of highway. Nothing in the building suggested wealth or importance, and yet everything about it suggested permanence, the sense of a place built to outlast the people who first raised its walls. Marcus ran a hand along one of the workbenches, feeling decades of scratches and burns left behind by tools that had clearly seen far more use than any ordinary hobbyist would ever put them through. It was this quiet permanence that had first drawn his eyes toward the back wall, where the photographs and trophies waited to tell their own story. While the coffee brewed and the rain continued drumming steadily outside, Marcus wandered toward the back wall of the garage, drawn by a collection of old photographs hanging in mismatched, dusty frames he had not noticed before. Faded images showed racing teams from decades past, men and women standing proudly beside machines that looked nothing like the sleek motorcycles parked outside tonight. Trophies lined a dusty shelf above the frames, some tarnished with age, others polished just enough to catch the dim light of the single overhead bulb swinging gently above them. Certificates hung beside them, their edges yellowed and curling, their signatures barely legible after so many years exposed to humidity and passing time. Marcus called Jake over, pointing toward the wall with a raised eyebrow, unable to hide his growing curiosity about what he had just discovered. Jake approached reluctantly, his skepticism still fully intact, until his eyes landed on something that made him stop entirely in his tracks. In the center of the wall hung a black and white photograph, showing a much younger Martha standing shoulder to shoulder with men who were unmistakably legends of the racing world, their names still spoken with reverence, decades after their careers had ended. Jake stared at the image for a long moment, his jaw slowly loosening, the weight of what he was seeing settling into his chest like a stone dropped quietly into still water. He asked Martha directly what the photograph meant, gesturing toward the wall, with a hand that trembled just slightly, despite his best efforts to appear unaffected. She glanced at it only briefly, offering nothing more than a small, tired smile and the simple words that it was an old story, one from another lifetime entirely, that she rarely spoke of anymore. Her refusal to elaborate only deepened the silence that had settled over the room, and for the first time since they had arrived, none of the bikers found anything left to laugh about. Beside the racing photograph hung a smaller frame that Danny noticed only after staring at the wall for several minutes, one showing Martha standing beside a younger man in coveralls, both of them grinning beside an engine, stripped down to its bare components. Marcus asked quietly who the man was, and for a moment Martha's expression softened into something private and tender that none of them had seen from her all night. "That was my husband," she said simply, her eyes lingering on the photograph a moment longer than necessary, before she turned back toward her work. She said nothing more about him, but the way her voice caught ever so slightly on the word husband told the room everything it needed to understand about how much that particular photograph still meant to her. Jake watched her carefully, sensing for the first time that there was far more depth to this woman than any of them had bothered to consider when they first pushed their dead motorcycles through her door. The laughter from earlier in the night now felt distant, almost shameful, hanging awkwardly in the humid air of the garage. Something shifted in the group after that moment, a quiet transformation that spread from one rider to the next, without anyone ever announcing it out loud. Marcus picked up a broom without being asked, and began sweeping the concrete floor near the crowded workbenches, working in silence. Danny gathered scattered tools and returned them carefully to their proper places along the wall, matching the exact order Martha had clearly maintained for years without fail. Two other men filled the coffee pot again, setting out mismatched mugs they found stacked neatly on a shelf near the small back office. One by one, voices softened into something closer to genuine gratitude, apologies slipping out in half-finished sentences that none of them seemed fully prepared to say aloud just yet. Jake remained near the wall of photographs, arms crossed, watching his friends change in ways he was clearly not yet ready to allow in himself. Despite everything he had witnessed with his own eyes throughout the long night, Jake still clung stubbornly to his doubts, unwilling to let go of the version of events he had walked in believing hours earlier. "She's still just a mechanic," he said under his breath to no one in particular, his voice carrying just enough for the room to hear it anyway despite his effort to keep it quiet. Martha, wiping down a wrench nearby, did not respond with anger or hurt feelings, only a small, knowing smile that suggested she had heard far worse from far angrier men over the many decades behind her. There was something almost peaceful about the way she let his words pass over her without protest, as though pride and recognition had stopped mattering to her a very long time ago in her life. The rain outside began to soften gradually into a lighter drizzle, and somewhere far beyond the tree line, the faintest gray light of early morning began creeping slowly across the distant horizon. None of the bikers noticed it yet, too absorbed in their own quiet reckoning with the night. But the darkness was finally beginning to turn toward dawn. By 5 a.m, the storm had passed entirely, leaving behind a low mist that clung stubbornly to the wet gravel just outside the garage doors. A new sound rose in the distance, deep and steady, unmistakably different from the growl of motorcycle engines the group had grown accustomed to throughout the long night behind them. Jake stepped toward the door first, frowning at the unfamiliar noise, expecting trouble given how strange the entire night had already become for all of them. What he saw instead made him freeze completely in the doorway, his breath catching somewhere deep in his throat before he could even speak. A long line of black limousines rolled slowly down the narrow road toward the garage, their headlights cutting through the fog, like something out of a dream. No one in that small town had ever imagined witnessing with their own eyes. Following close behind the limousines came two patrol cars, lights spinning silently without sirens, as though this arrival had been carefully expected and planned well in advance by everyone except the confused men standing in the doorway. The convoy pulled into the gravel lot with practiced precision, engines idling low, doors opening almost in unison as a dozen figures stepped out into the cool, misty morning air surrounding the garage. Jake called for the others, his voice tight with confusion, and one by one the bikers gathered behind him in the doorway to witness the strange procession forming just outside. Sheriff Collins, who had never actually left the property throughout the entire night, walked calmly toward the lead vehicle, as though greeting old friends rather than complete strangers arriving unannounced. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances among themselves, certain now that something far bigger than a simple stranded motorcycle repair was unfolding directly before their eyes. None of them moved from the doorway, too stunned by the sight to do anything but watch in silence. Word of the strange convoy had already begun reaching the edges of town, where a handful of early risers stood on their porches, watching the black limousines glide past on their way toward the old garage. Farmers heading out to their fields slowed their trucks along the shoulder of the highway, squinting through the morning mist at a sight none of them had ever expected to see on this quiet stretch of road. A few pulled over entirely, stepping out to watch from a respectful distance, whispering questions to one another that none of them could answer. By the time the convoy reached the garage itself, a small crowd had begun to gather near the tree line, drawn by curiosity and the rare spectacle of wealth arriving in a town that saw very little of it. None of them approached, understanding somehow that whatever was unfolding belonged to Martha alone, and that their place was simply to watch in quiet wonder from a distance. The town that had walked past her garage for decades without a second glance now stood still, finally paying attention. A tall man, in an impeccably tailored suit, stepped forward from the group, his polished shoes barely disturbing the wet gravel beneath him, his expression calm and composed despite the unusually early hour of the morning. He walked directly past the bikers without acknowledging their open stares, moving straight toward Martha, who stood near the workbench wiping grease slowly from her weathered hands with an old rag. "Ma'am," he said, bowing his head slightly before extending a leather folder toward her with both hands outstretched in a formal, practiced gesture. The gesture carried the unmistakable weight of a formal ceremony, the kind normally reserved for people of extraordinary importance rather than the quiet owner of a roadside repair shop on a forgotten highway. Martha accepted the folder without any visible surprise on her face, her expression calm, as though this exact scene had played out many times before across the years behind her. Sheriff Collins turned toward the stunned bikers and explained quietly that this happened every single year, always around this same time, always without warning to anyone outside a small circle who fully understood exactly what it meant. Inside the leather folder, tucked among neatly typed pages, sat a fresh set of documents, renewing an endowment that funded scholarships for young technicians who could not otherwise afford proper training in the trade Martha had spent her life mastering. There were letters, too, handwritten notes from former students scattered across the country, each one thanking her for lessons that had shaped careers, saved lives, and in some cases kept entire families afloat during difficult years. Martha flipped through the pages slowly, her expression unreadable, pausing occasionally on a name or a photograph tucked between the papers before closing the folder gently and setting it aside on the workbench. She thanked the suited man quietly, the same way she might have thanked a customer for paying an ordinary bill, without any trace of the ceremony the moment seemed to demand from her. The bikers watched this exchange with a growing sense that they had wandered, quite by accident, into the middle of something far larger than themselves. Whatever pride Jake still carried when he first pushed his motorcycle through her door had all but vanished entirely by now. Jake finally found his voice, though it came out smaller than he had intended, asking what exactly was happening here and who all these unfamiliar people were. The man in the suit turned toward him, studying the group of leather-clad riders with an expression that held no judgment in it at all, only quiet patience. He explained, calmly and without hurry, that the woman standing before them was far more than a small-town mechanic, simply scraping by on the edge of an old forgotten highway. Decades earlier, Martha Johnson had founded a training academy that offered completely free instruction to aspiring motorcycle technicians who could never otherwise have afforded a proper formal education. She had designed engine innovations that eventually became industry standards, changes so significant that most modern riders benefited from her work every single day without ever once knowing her name. For years afterward, she served as a technical consultant for several national racing teams, her expertise sought after by people who traveled great distances just to hear her opinion on a single design flaw. The suited man continued speaking, explaining that despite retiring from public recognition many years earlier, Martha had never fully stepped away from her original passion for keeping riders safe on dangerous roads across the country. Her name had faded from public memory over time, deliberately so, since she had asked long ago to be left quietly in peace rather than celebrated publicly for her achievements. Yet a small circle of former students, racing officials, and grateful former colleagues never once forgot what she had done for their industry and for countless riders who might otherwise have died alone on lonely highways. Each year, without fail, they returned to this same humble garage, bringing updates, honors, and simple heartfelt gratitude that Martha rarely accepted with more than a quiet, humble nod of acknowledgement. The bikers stood frozen where they were, absorbing information that reshaped everything they thought they had understood about the woman who had spent the entire night quietly fixing their engines without a single complaint. Jake glanced back toward Martha, his earlier pride now replaced entirely by something closer to genuine shame. One of the older men, accompanying the suited representative, stepped forward next, introducing himself as a former student who had once arrived at this very garage decades earlier, with nothing but a broken bicycle and a desperate hope for something better in life. He explained that Martha had taught him everything he knew about engines, about patience, and about treating every single person who walked through that door with the same quiet dignity, regardless of how they arrived or what they carried with them. He now ran a successful chain of repair shops across 3 different states, employing dozens of mechanics he had personally trained, using the very same methods Martha had taught him all those years ago. Every year, he said, he made the long drive back here simply to thank her, though she never once let him linger on the gratitude for very long, before changing the subject entirely. The bikers listened in silence, understanding now that the woman they had mocked hours earlier had quietly shaped an entire generation of careers, without ever once seeking credit for any of it. Jake lowered his eyes, unable to meet Martha's gaze for several long, uncomfortable seconds. Once the crowd outside had quieted and the limousines sat waiting patiently in the misty gravel lot, Jake finally worked up the courage to ask the question that had been forming steadily in his mind since the moment the wall of photographs first revealed her past. He asked her plainly why she still lived here, in this small, crumbling garage, when clearly she could have lived anywhere else in far greater comfort and recognition. Martha turned to look at the old building surrounding her, her eyes drifting slowly over walls that had witnessed more than half a century of storms, repairs, and quiet mornings, just like this one before it. She explained, in a voice softer than any she had used all night, that she and her late husband had built this garage together with their own hands, board by board, bolt by bolt, back when neither of them had anything but determination and a shared dream to hold on to. After he passed away, she never found the will to leave this place, choosing instead to preserve every small detail exactly as it had been during their happiest years together. It was not poverty that kept her here, she said firmly, but a promise she had made long ago and never once considered breaking for any reason. She told them that the promise was simple, though its meaning had shaped every single day of her life since her husband's passing many years earlier. She wanted this garage to remain a place where anyone stranded on the road, regardless of who they were or what they could afford to pay, would always find someone willing to help them safely through the night. It did not matter if they arrived wealthy or broke, respected or dismissed, kind or cruel in their very first impression of her, since she had learned long ago that circumstances alone rarely reveal a person's true character until much later. Money had never truly been the point of any of this. and identity had never mattered to her nearly as much as whether someone simply needed help finding their way safely home. The bikers, every single one of them, fell into complete silence as her words settled over the room like the last quiet moments after a long storm finally passes overhead. Even Jake, standing near the doorway with his arms finally uncrossed, found himself completely unable to speak. The weight of the entire night pressed down on him all at once. Every insult he had thrown carelessly into the rain now returning to him with painful, undeniable clarity he could no longer ignore. He stepped forward slowly, reaching into his jacket for the folded cash he had prepared earlier to pay for repairs he assumed would cost far more than Martha had ever intended to charge any of them. He held it out toward her, his hand steady, despite the emotion clearly building behind his tired eyes after everything he had just heard. Martha shook her head gently, refusing the money, the same way she had refused public recognition for decades, insisting quietly that the repairs themselves had already been payment enough for a night well spent together. Jake shook his head in return, pressing the folded bills a little closer toward her, his voice finally breaking through the silence that had held the entire room captive for several long minutes. "This isn't payment for the repairs," he said quietly, his voice thick with something he clearly was not used to feeling in front of other men. "This is respect," he continued. "Respect that we should have given you the very moment we walked through that door, instead of waiting until dawn to finally understand who you really were all along." One by one, the other bikers stepped forward behind him, removing their riding gloves in a slow, deliberate gesture that needed no further explanation from anyone standing there. They lowered their heads toward Martha, not out of any sense of obligation, but out of genuine reverence for a woman who had spent an entire lifetime giving far more than she ever asked to receive in return. Sheriff Collins watched quietly from near the doorway, a small smile forming beneath his weathered face. Having witnessed this same quiet transformation happen in different forms, many times over the years he had spent standing guard near this very garage. The suited man and his associates returned quietly to their waiting limousines, understanding without needing to be told that this particular moment belonged entirely to Martha and the men whose hearts had visibly changed before her eyes. Engines started outside, headlights swept briefly across the wet gravel, and the entire convoy disappeared slowly back into the fading morning mist together. As the last limousine vanished around the bend in the narrow road, Martha turned back toward her garage, reaching for the same old jacket she had worn since long before any of these men had ever learned to ride a motorcycle of their own. She slipped it over her shoulders without ceremony, the grease stains and worn seams as familiar to her as her own quiet reflection in the cracked mirror by the door. The bikers watched her move toward the door, expecting some final word, some closing statement worthy of everything they had just witnessed together throughout this long and unforgettable night. Instead, she simply reached for the chain hanging beside the frame and pulled the garage door open once more, ready for whatever the coming day might bring toward her lonely stretch of highway. A pickup truck rattled to a stop just beyond the gravel lot moments later, its engine sputtering weakly, its driver stepping out with an apologetic look already forming across his tired face. Martha walked toward him without hesitation, greeting him the exact same way she had greeted the bikers hours earlier, as though nothing extraordinary had ever happened at her garage that night at all. Danny lingered near the doorway a while longer than the others, watching the mist finally begin to burn away under the rising sun, thinking about how close he had come to writing this entire night off, as nothing more than bad luck on a long ride home. He thought about the words he had used hours earlier, the doubt he had carried about a stranger's ability simply because of how she looked standing in her own doorway. It occurred to him now that the same skepticism had almost cost him a chance to witness something far more meaningful than a simple engine repair completed on a stormy night. He climbed onto his own motorcycle slowly, glancing one final time toward the garage before pulling out onto the highway behind the others, the newly repaired engine beneath him running smoother than it ever had before. The road ahead stretched out clear and golden under the morning light, and for the first time in a long while, he found himself thinking less about the destination and more about the lesson he was carrying forward. Behind him, the garage stood exactly as it always had, unchanged by everything that had just unfolded within its walls. Jake lingered behind for just a moment before finally following his friends out into the brightening morning, turning back once more to watch Martha kneel beside the stranger's truck with the same patient care she had shown them all night long. He understood now, in a way he never could have understood hours earlier, that her worth had never once depended on anyone else's recognition or approval to be real. The wealth, the trophies, the honored visitors arriving each year in polished limousines, none of it had changed who she truly was underneath, since she had always been exactly this person long before any of it ever existed. It was the town, the strangers, and men like himself who had simply needed the truth revealed before they were finally willing to see her clearly for who she really was. As he climbed back onto his motorcycle and turned the key, the engine answering him instantly and perfectly, he found himself glancing once more toward the woman, kneeling quietly in the gravel, entirely unbothered by everything that had just unfolded around her. The morning sun broke fully over the horizon at last, spreading warm golden light across the wet road, stretching out ahead of them. Long after the motorcycles had disappeared down the highway and the small crowd near the tree line had drifted back to their morning routines, the garage stood quiet once again, exactly as it had stood for 50 years before that single stormy night. Martha moved between the pickup truck and her workbench, with the same unhurried rhythm she had carried since the beginning, unaware or simply unconcerned that 8 strangers had left her presence forever changed. The rain clouds had cleared completely now, leaving behind a sky washed clean and pale blue, stretching wide over the fields surrounding the old highway. Somewhere down that same road, 8 riders carried a lesson with them that no classroom or lecture could ever have taught quite as effectively as one long, humbling night had managed to teach them. And somewhere behind them, in a garage built from nothing but 2 hands and one unbroken promise, an old woman kept doing exactly what she had always done, expecting no thanks and needing none at all. People often judge first by age, by the color of skin, or by the clothes someone happens to be wearing when they walk through an unfamiliar door on a rainy night. Only when the light of dawn finally breaks does the true value of a person reveal itself clearly enough for even the most stubborn eyes to finally see it. Kindness rarely announces itself with trophies or headlines, and true character has never once needed applause to remain genuine through decades of quiet, thankless work behind closed doors. Respect belongs to every single person from the very first moment they are met, not only after their achievements have been proven or their past has been fully uncovered by others. Experience and integrity speak far louder in the end than any boast ever could, echoing long after the noise of pride and prejudice has finally faded into silence around them. And somewhere on a quiet highway, in a garage built by hands that never once stopped believing in the promise they made so many years ago, that lesson continues to greet every stranded traveler who finds their way there in the middle of the night, expecting nothing and receiving everything they truly needed all along.